Morning prayer to cancel evil altars over a black father's household blessings flow. Your family's time in this house is finished, Mr. Johnson. The foreclosure is final, and I'll have the sheriff remove you by force if necessary. Mr. Harrison, you'll find that what the enemy meant for evil, God has already turned for good. This house will remain in my family. The words hung in the air of the modest living room like a challenge between two generals. Samuel Johnson stood in the doorway of the home where he had raised his children, his gray hair catching the morning light that streamed through the windows his late wife had dressed with curtains she'd sewn herself. Samuel Johnson was 62 years old, his shoulders still broad despite the years, his hands calloused from 4 decades of honest work. He wore his Sunday best, a navy suit that had seen better days but was pressed with dignity, and his eyes held the kind of quiet strength that comes only from walking through fire and emerging refined. Across from Samuel Johnson stood Richard Harrison, a real estate developer whose expensive suit probably cost more than Samuel Johnson's monthly pension. Richard Harrison had driven up in a black luxury sedan, accompanied by 2 attorneys and a notary. Richard Harrison had come to finalize the seizure of the Johnson family home, a 3-bedroom house on Maple Street that had been in Samuel Johnson's family since 1968, purchased with his father's life savings after years of saving every penny from his job at the steel mill. The tension in that room could have been cut with a knife. Richard Harrison's face had flushed red at Samuel Johnson's calm response. Richard Harrison was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by men like Samuel Johnson. Men Richard Harrison had spent his career displacing from their neighborhoods in the name of development and progress. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Richard Harrison said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I've taken 50 properties in this neighborhood alone. What makes you think your little house is special?" Samuel Johnson smiled then, a small knowing smile that seemed to unsettle Richard Harrison more than any threat could have. Samuel Johnson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn leather Bible, its pages soft from years of daily reading, its cover creased from being carried in work trucks and hospital waiting rooms and everywhere in between. "Because this morning, like every morning for the past 40 years, I prayed," Samuel Johnson said. "And this morning, God showed me something. He showed me that every altar raised against this household, every scheme designed to tear down what my father built, every curse spoken over my family's future, all of it falls today. But let's go back to how this all started." It was just 6 hours earlier when Samuel Johnson had first knelt beside his bed in the pre-dawn darkness, as he had done every single morning since 1985, the year his wife Martha had been diagnosed with cancer, and the doctors had given her 6 months to live. Martha Johnson had survived 15 more years, long enough to see all 3 of their children graduate college, long enough to hold her first grandchild. Samuel Johnson had never stopped those morning prayers, even after Martha Johnson passed in 2000, even during the lonely years that followed. That particular Tuesday morning in September 2025 had started like countless others. The alarm clock, the same one Samuel Johnson and Martha Johnson had received as a wedding gift in 1963, buzzed at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning. Samuel Johnson had risen from bed, his knees protesting slightly as they always did these days, and made his way to the small bathroom down the hall. The house had been quiet in that pre-dawn hour, holding the accumulated silence of 57 years of family life. After washing his face with cold water, a habit from his Navy days back in 1965, Samuel Johnson had returned to his bedroom and lowered himself carefully beside the bed. The carpet was worn thin in that exact spot from decades of this same ritual. Samuel Johnson had placed both hands flat on the bed's surface, closed his eyes, and begun to pray. "Father God," Samuel Johnson had said aloud, his voice quiet but firm in the darkness, "I come before you this morning as I have every morning, thanking you for the breath in my lungs and the roof over my head. Lord, you know the troubles facing this household. You know that my son Marcus is in difficulty. You know that men with more money and more power than we have are trying to take this house that my father built with his own 2 hands. Samuel Johnson had paused then, the weight of the situation pressing down on his shoulders. His son Marcus, 40 years old and struggling with gambling debts, had made a terrible mistake 6 months earlier. Marcus Johnson had forged Samuel Johnson's signature on loan documents, using the family home as collateral for debts that Marcus Johnson could never hope to repay. When Samuel Johnson had discovered what Marcus Johnson had done, The old man's heart had nearly broken. But Samuel Johnson had not turned his son away. Instead, Samuel Johnson had fought to find a solution, any solution, to save both his son and the family legacy. "Lord, I don't understand why this is happening," Samuel Johnson had continued in that morning prayer. "But I know you are sovereign. I know that no weapon formed against us will prosper. So this morning I pray against every evil altar raised against this household. Every generational curse, every scheme of the enemy, every person who has plotted to see us fail, I cancel their plans in Jesus' name. I declare that blessings will flow where curses have been spoken. I declare that this house will remain in my family as a testimony of your faithfulness." Samuel Johnson had prayed for nearly an hour that morning, longer than usual. Something had stirred in his spirit, a sense of urgency mixed with unexpected peace. When Samuel Johnson had finally risen from his knees, the sun had been painting the eastern sky pink and gold. Samuel Johnson had known, with a certainty that defied logic, that today would be the day everything changed. At 6:30 that morning, Samuel Johnson had made his way to the kitchen and started a pot of coffee, community coffee, the same brand his mother had used, shipped up from Louisiana twice a year by his cousin. The familiar smell had filled the small kitchen as Samuel Johnson had prepared his breakfast: grits, 2 eggs over easy, and toast. Simple food, the kind that had sustained him through years at the shipyard, through raising 3 children, through burying his beloved Martha. While Samuel Johnson had eaten his breakfast at the kitchen table, he had looked around at the walls of his home. There hung the photographs that told the story of the Johnson family. Samuel Johnson's father, Robert Johnson, standing proud in his Army uniform in 1945. Samuel Johnson and Martha Johnson on their wedding day, both of them so young and full of hope. Their 3 children, Marcus, Lisa, and David, at various ages, gap-toothed and grinning. Grandchildren he loved more than life itself. Every picture represented a life built with purpose and faith. The knock on the door had come at 7:15 that morning, earlier than expected. Samuel Johnson had set down his coffee cup, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and walked calmly to the front door. Through the window, Samuel Johnson had seen Richard Harrison's luxury sedan parked at the curb, ostentatious and out of place on Maple Street, where most folks drove 10-year-old Fords and Chevrolets. Samuel Johnson had opened the door to find Richard Harrison flanked by 2 men in expensive suits carrying leather briefcases. Richard Harrison had been holding a folder thick with legal documents. "Mr. Johnson," Richard Harrison had said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I'm here to finalize the transfer of this property. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, but either way, this house now belongs to Harrison Development Corporation." And that was how Samuel Johnson had ended up standing in his own living room, facing down a man who saw this house as nothing more than another acquisition, another property to be flipped or demolished for profit. Richard Harrison did not see the memories in these walls. Richard Harrison did not know that Samuel Johnson's father, Robert Johnson, had mixed the concrete for the foundation himself in 1968, working weekends and evenings after his shifts at the mill. Richard Harrison did not know that Martha Johnson had planted the rose bushes in the front yard in 1970, or that all 3 Johnson children had taken their first steps on the worn hardwood floors of this very living room. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. Now, in that moment of confrontation, Samuel Johnson had opened his Bible to a page he knew by heart. The thin pages whispered as Samuel Johnson turned to Psalm 91, a passage Martha Johnson had read to him during her cancer treatments, a passage Samuel Johnson had claimed over his family for decades. "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty," Samuel Johnson read aloud, his voice steady and clear. "I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him will I trust." Richard Harrison had laughed then, a sharp barking sound devoid of humor. "Are you seriously reading Bible verses at me? This is a legal matter, Mr. Johnson. Your son signed documents. He used this house as collateral. The debt is in default. Your faith doesn't change the law. You're right that my son made a mistake," Samuel Johnson had acknowledged, closing his Bible but keeping one finger between the pages as a bookmark. "Marcus made a terrible mistake, and he'll have to live with that. But what you don't know, Mr. Harrison, is that those documents Marcus signed were obtained through fraud." Richard Harrison's expression had shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he schooled his features back to confidence. "That's a serious accusation." "It is," Samuel Johnson had agreed. "It's also the truth. 6 months ago, my son Marcus was approached by a man named Vincent Wade. Vincent Wade told Marcus that he could help with Marcus's gambling debts, that he knew people who could make the problems go away. All Marcus had to do was sign some papers. The room had grown very still. Richard Harrison's 2 attorneys had exchanged glances, their confident postures wavering slightly. Samuel Johnson had continued, his voice growing stronger. What Marcus didn't know, what he was too desperate to see, was that Vincent Wade was working for you, Mr. Harrison. Vincent Wade deliberately targeted Marcus after researching this property. Vincent Wade knew that this house sits on land you want for your new development. Vincent Wade knew that if you could acquire this property, you'd have the entire block. So Vincent Wade offered Marcus a loan with terms Marcus could never meet, buried in 50 pages of legal documents that Marcus didn't read carefully enough because Vincent Wade kept pressing him, telling him time was running out. Richard Harrison's face had gone very still, the confident smirk disappearing. "You can't prove any of that, can't I?" Samuel Johnson had said, and now his smile had returned, that same knowing expression that seemed to see right through Richard Harrison's expensive suit and polished shoes. "Last week, Vincent Wade had an attack of conscience. Turns out Vincent Wade has a father too, a father who's sick and dying. Vincent Wade went to see his father in the hospital, and his father asked Vincent Wade one simple question. 'Are you living right, son?' That question ate at Vincent Wade until he couldn't sleep at night." Samuel Johnson had walked slowly to the bookshelf where Martha Johnson's collection of devotionals still sat, arranged just as she had left them. Samuel Johnson had pulled out a large manila envelope that had been tucked behind the books. "Vincent Wade came to see me 4 days ago," Samuel Johnson had said, holding up the envelope. "Vincent Wade sat right there in that chair where you're standing, Mr. Harrison, and Vincent Wade told me everything. How you paid him to target vulnerable homeowners in this neighborhood, how you told him to use whatever methods necessary to acquire properties, how you promised Vincent Wade a percentage of the profits once you developed this land. And Vincent Wade gave me something very valuable." Samuel Johnson had opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are copies of your emails to Vincent Wade, instructions on which houses to target, discussion of how to structure the fraudulent loans." And this, Samuel Johnson had held up a small recording device, the kind that looked like a pen. "This is a recording of a conversation between you and Vincent Wade from 3 weeks ago, where you explicitly discussed manipulating my son into signing documents he didn't understand." The color had drained from Richard Harrison's face. The 2 attorneys had stepped back, distancing themselves literally and figuratively from their client. One of them had opened his briefcase and pulled out a phone, beginning to type rapidly with his thumbs. That's illegal recording," Richard Harrison had sputtered. "Actually, in this state, only one party needs to consent to a recording," Samuel Johnson had said calmly. "Vincent Wade consented. Vincent Wade wore this pen to your meeting. Vincent Wade also provided sworn testimony to my attorney. Which is why, Mr. Harrison, at 9 o'clock this morning, Samuel Johnson had checked his watch. In about 90 minutes, your company will be served with a lawsuit for fraud, elder abuse, and predatory lending practices. My attorney has also sent all of this evidence to the State Attorney General's office and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division." The silence that had followed was deafening. Richard Harrison had seemed to shrink in his expensive suit. One of the attorneys had closed his briefcase with a decisive snap. "Mr. Harrison, I need to speak with you outside immediately," the attorney had said, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "This changes everything." But Richard Harrison had been staring at Samuel Johnson with something that looked like disbelief mixed with grudging respect. Why would Vincent Wade turn on me?" "Because," Samuel Johnson had said gently, "Vincent Wade's father is dying of the same cancer that took my wife. Vincent Wade has been sitting in that hospital room, watching his father struggle, and Vincent Wade realized that all the money in the world doesn't matter if you can't look your father in the eye and tell him you lived with integrity. Vincent Wade's father was in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Vincent Wade's father was beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. Vincent Wade's father dedicated his life to fighting for justice, and when Vincent Wade's father asked if his son was living right, Vincent Wade couldn't lie anymore." Richard Harrison had stood there for a long moment, all his bluster and confidence evaporated. Finally, Richard Harrison had straightened his tie and picked up his briefcase. "My attorneys will be in touch," Richard Harrison had said stiffly. "I'm sure they will," Samuel Johnson had replied. "And Mr. Harrison, I want you to know something. I prayed for you this morning. I prayed for your soul, because a man who makes his living destroying families needs prayer more than anyone. I hope someday you'll understand that there are some things money can't buy, and one of those things is peace of mind." Richard Harrison had left without another word, his attorneys hurrying after him. Samuel Johnson had watched through the window as the luxury sedan pulled away from the curb, probably for the last time. Then Samuel Johnson had returned to the kitchen, reheated his coffee in the microwave, and sat back down at his breakfast table. But the story didn't end there. The ramifications of that morning stretched out like ripples in a pond, touching every member of the Johnson family and beyond. At 8 o'clock that same morning, Samuel Johnson's son Marcus had pulled up in front of the house in his battered Honda Civic. Marcus Johnson was 40 years old but looked older, worn down by the weight of his mistakes. Marcus Johnson had been staying with his sister Lisa for the past 2 months, too ashamed to face his father. But Lisa Johnson had called Marcus early that morning and told him he needed to get to the house right away. Marcus Johnson had walked slowly up the front path, his feet heavy with dread. Marcus Johnson expected to find the house empty, his father evicted, his family legacy destroyed by his own foolish choices. Instead, Marcus Johnson found Samuel Johnson sitting calmly at the kitchen table, reading the morning newspaper like it was any other day. "Dad," Marcus Johnson had said from the doorway, his voice cracking with emotion. Samuel Johnson had looked up from his paper and smiled at his son. "Come in, Marcus. Sit down. I'll pour you some coffee." Marcus Johnson had entered hesitantly, taking a seat across from Samuel Johnson at the same table where Marcus had eaten thousands of meals as a child, where Martha Johnson had helped Marcus with homework, where the Johnson family had celebrated birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings. Marcus's hands had trembled as he accepted the coffee cup. "Dad, I'm so sorry," Marcus had begun, tears streaming down his face. "I've destroyed everything. I've lost the house. I've dishonored your name and Mom's memory. I don't know how to make this right." Samuel Johnson had reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over Marcus's. "Son, look at me." Marcus had raised his eyes to meet his father's gaze. "The house is saved," Samuel Johnson had said simply. Marcus had stared at Samuel Johnson in confusion. "What? How? The foreclosure was final. That developer is gone," Samuel Johnson had finished. "And he won't be coming back. The fraud has been exposed, the loan documents are void, and this house remains in our family." Marcus Johnson had put his head down on the table and wept like a child, his shoulders shaking with relief and shame and gratitude all mixed together. Samuel Johnson had let his son cry, had sat there with one hand on Marcus's shoulder, providing the silent comfort that fathers have given their sons since the beginning of time. When Marcus had finally composed himself, Samuel Johnson had poured them both fresh coffee and told Marcus the whole story, Vincent Wade's change of heart, the evidence, the confrontation with Richard Harrison. Marcus had listened in amazement, occasionally wiping his eyes with the napkin Samuel Johnson had handed him. "But Dad," Marcus had said when Samuel Johnson finished, "I still caused all this. If I hadn't been so stupid, so desperate, none of this would have happened." "That's true," Samuel Johnson had acknowledged, because Samuel Johnson believed in truth even when it was uncomfortable. "You made bad choices, Marcus. You let gambling control your life. You violated my trust by forging my signature. Those are serious things, and there will be consequences. You'll need to get help for the gambling. You'll need to rebuild trust with this family. That's not going to happen overnight." Marcus had nodded, accepting the hard truth of Samuel Johnson's words. "But," Samuel Johnson had continued, "that doesn't mean you're beyond redemption. Your mother and I raised you to be better than your worst mistake. We raised you to be a man who takes responsibility and makes things right. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to move back into your old room here at the house. You're going to get a job, any honest job. You're going to attend Gamblers Anonymous meetings 3 times a week. And you're going to help me maintain this house the way your grandfather Robert taught me to maintain it." You're not throwing me out?" Marcus had asked, his voice barely a whisper. "This is your home," Samuel Johnson had said firmly. "It was your grandfather's home, it's been my home, and God willing, it'll be your children's home someday. We don't throw away family, Marcus. We restore family. We rebuild what's been broken. That's what this household is about." The two men had embraced then, father and son, in that kitchen that held so many memories. And in that embrace, something shifted in Marcus Johnson's heart. Marcus felt the weight of shame begin to lift, replaced by something Marcus had not felt in a long time, hope. By noon that same day, the entire neighborhood had heard what happened. Samuel Johnson's daughter Lisa had stopped by with her 2 children, Samuel Johnson's grandchildren, 8-year-old Joshua and 6-year-old Naomi. Lisa Johnson was 38 years old, a high school English teacher, strong and capable like her mother had been. Lisa Johnson had thrown her arms around Samuel Johnson when she arrived. "Dad, Marcus called and told me everything. I can't believe it. I was so scared we were going to lose this house." "God is faithful," Samuel Johnson had said simply, hugging his daughter and then kneeling down to embrace his grandchildren. "He has always been faithful to this family." Little Naomi had looked up at Samuel Johnson with wide eyes. "Grandpa, Marcus said you saved the house with a recording pen like a spy." Samuel Johnson had laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Well, I had some help from a man who decided to do the right thing. Sometimes, Naomi, God answers prayers in unexpected ways." That afternoon, Samuel Johnson's youngest son, David, had arrived from Atlanta, having driven through the night after Lisa called him with the news. David Johnson was 35, a software engineer who had moved away for work but called his father every Sunday without fail. David Johnson had worried constantly about the house situation, had offered several times to try to buy out the fraudulent loan himself, though David didn't have that kind of money either. "Pop," David had said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use, "I've been praying about this for months. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on work. I kept thinking about losing the house, about everything Grandpa Robert built just being torn down for some developer's profit." Samuel Johnson had embraced his youngest son. "I know you were worried, David. I know all my children have been carrying this burden, but that's why I pray every morning. Someone has to stand in the gap for this family, has to speak blessings over this household when the world speaks curses." That evening, the Johnson house was full in a way it hadn't been since Martha's funeral 5 years ago. All 3 of Samuel Johnson's children were there, along with 4 grandchildren. They had ordered pizza, something Martha Johnson had always insisted on for family gatherings because nobody wants to cook when we should be spending time together. They ate around the same dining table that Robert Johnson had built by hand in 1970, its oak surface scarred by decades of use, but still solid and strong. As they ate, Samuel Johnson told the whole story again for David's benefit and for the grandchildren to hear. Samuel Johnson explained, in terms the children could understand, about how sometimes people make mistakes but can find their way back to doing right. Samuel Johnson talked about Vincent Wade's change of heart, about how a father's question had sparked a conscience, about how one person's decision to tell the truth had saved a family's legacy. "But Grandpa," Joshua had asked, "why did your prayers work? My friend Tommy says prayers don't really do anything." Samuel Johnson had set down his slice of pizza and looked at his grandson thoughtfully. "Let me tell you something about prayer, Joshua. Prayer isn't magic. Prayer doesn't force God to do what we want. But prayer does something powerful. Prayer aligns our hearts with God's will. Prayer reminds us that we're not alone, that we're not fighting our battles in our own strength." Samuel Johnson had gestured around the room. "Every morning for 40 years, I've prayed for this household. I've prayed for protection, for wisdom, for blessing. And do you know what those prayers have done? They've kept me connected to God. They've given me peace in difficult times. They've reminded me to treat people with kindness even when they don't deserve it. And sometimes, in ways I can't explain, those prayers move circumstances. They open doors. They touch hearts like they touched Vincent Wade's heart." "So God helped you save the house?" Naomi had asked. "God did save the house," Samuel Johnson had confirmed. "But God used people to do it. God used Vincent Wade's conscience. God used my attorney who worked hard to build a case. God used the laws that protect people from fraud. God doesn't usually send angels to fix our problems, children. Usually, God works through ordinary people who choose to do the right thing." Later that evening, after the grandchildren had fallen asleep in various rooms and the adults were sitting on the front porch in the cool September air, Lisa had asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Dad, what happens to Marcus now? I mean, really, he still has gambling debts. He still made all those mistakes." Samuel Johnson had rocked slowly in the chair that had been his father's, the chair Robert Johnson had sat in every evening after work, surveying the neighborhood Robert Johnson had been so proud to be part of. "Marcus has a hard road ahead," Samuel Johnson had acknowledged. "The legal trouble from the forged signature, that's been resolved because the loan itself was fraudulent, so there's no valid contract. But Marcus's real challenge is healing from the addiction that got him here. That's going to take time and work and humility." "Will he do it?" David had asked. "Will he really follow through?" "I believe he will," Samuel Johnson had said. "I saw something in Marcus's eyes this morning that I haven't seen in years. I saw genuine remorse. I saw determination. And I saw the same strength that his grandfather had, that his mother had. Marcus has that strength too. He just forgot about it for a while. Marcus, who had been standing at the porch railing looking out at the street, had turned to face his father. "I won't let you down again, Dad, I swear it." "Don't swear it to me," Samuel Johnson had said. "Swear it to yourself, swear it to your mother's memory, and then every single day wake up and prove it." In the weeks that followed that dramatic Tuesday morning, the story of what happened at the Johnson house spread through the neighborhood and beyond. Richard Harrison's development company came under investigation by state and federal authorities. Vincent Wade, granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, provided evidence against Richard Harrison that led to criminal charges. Richard Harrison's empire, built on the suffering of families like the Johnsons, began to crumble. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was happening inside the walls of the house on Maple Street. Marcus Johnson found a job at a local warehouse, third shift, loading trucks. It wasn't glamorous work, and Marcus's body ached at the end of each shift. But Marcus showed up every day. Marcus started attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings at a church 3 blocks away. Marcus began, slowly and painfully, to rebuild his life. Samuel Johnson was there every step of the way, not hovering or controlling, but present. Every morning, Marcus would wake to the sound of his father praying in the next room, that same daily ritual that had sustained Samuel Johnson through 4 decades of life's challenges. Sometimes Marcus would stand outside Samuel Johnson's door and listen to his father's voice, strong and steady, speaking blessings over the household, canceling curses, declaring victory over every attack against the family. 2 months after the confrontation with Richard Harrison, on a Sunday morning in November, something remarkable happened. Samuel Johnson had gone to the early service at First Baptist Church, where he had been a deacon since 1978. Samuel Johnson had sat in the same pew where Martha Johnson had sat beside him for 37 years, where they had dedicated their children, where they had weathered every storm of married life. After the service, as Samuel Johnson was shaking hands with old friends in the fellowship hall, a man approached him. The man was young, maybe 30 years old, with a thin face and haunted eyes. The man waited patiently until Samuel Johnson finished his conversation, then stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson," the man had said hesitantly, "my name is Vincent Wade." Samuel Johnson had turned to look at the young man fully. Vincent Wade had lost weight since that day he had visited the Johnson house. Vincent Wade looked tired but somehow lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. "Vincent," Samuel Johnson had said, extending his hand. "How is your father?" Vincent Wade had taken Samuel Johnson's hand, his grip firm despite his thin frame. "He passed away 3 weeks ago, but before he died, I got to tell him everything. I got to tell him that I'd exposed the fraud, that I'd helped save your family's house. And you know what he said?" Samuel Johnson had waited quietly. "He said, 'That's my boy, that's the son I raised.'" Vincent Wade's eyes had filled with tears. "Mr. Johnson, my father died knowing I'd done the right thing. He died proud of me. I can't tell you what that means." Samuel Johnson had placed both hands on Vincent Wade's shoulders. "Vincent, your father was right to be proud. You made mistakes, yes. But when it mattered most, you chose integrity over profit. You chose truth over security. That took real courage." "I came to apologize," Vincent Wade had said, "for targeting your son for everything, and to thank you. You said you'd prayed for me that morning. Nobody's ever told me they prayed for me, especially not someone I'd hurt." "I meant it," Samuel Johnson had said, "and I'm still praying for you. What are your plans now?" Vincent Wade had straightened slightly. "I'm going back to school, getting my teaching certificate. I want to work with at-risk youth, help them avoid the mistakes I made." "And Mr. Johnson, I've started going to church again, first time in 10 years. I'm trying to find my way back." Samuel Johnson had smiled then, the same knowing smile he had given Richard Harrison, but this time filled with warmth instead of challenge. "Vincent, that's the bravest thing you've said yet. Finding your way back is always harder than walking away in the first place. But God's mercies are new every morning. He's not done with you yet." The two men had talked for another 20 minutes, Vincent Wade telling Samuel Johnson about his plans, Samuel Johnson offering guidance and encouragement. Before Vincent Wade left, Samuel Johnson had prayed with him right there in the church fellowship hall, prayed for Vincent Wade's future, for healing from guilt, for strength to stay on the right path. Several people had stopped to stare, but Samuel Johnson didn't care. This was what faith looked like in action. At Thanksgiving that year, the Johnson family gathered around the dining table that Robert Johnson had built, in the house that Robert Johnson had purchased with his life savings. Samuel Johnson sat at the head of the table, his 3 children and 4 grandchildren surrounding him. Lisa had cooked Martha Johnson's traditional Thanksgiving recipes: dressing with sage, sweet potato casserole with pecans, green beans slow-cooked with ham hocks. The smells filling the house were the same smells from Thanksgiving's past, connecting the present to 50 years of family tradition. Before the meal, as was the family custom, Samuel Johnson asked each person to share something they were thankful for. The grandchildren went first, mentioning toys and school friends with the unself-conscious honesty of children. Lisa spoke about her students and the privilege of shaping young minds. David talked about his job going well and being able to help support the family. When it came to Marcus, the table grew quiet. Marcus had been showing up to work every day for 3 months now. Marcus had attended 72 consecutive Gamblers Anonymous meetings. Marcus had not placed a bet since that terrible day 6 months ago when he had forged his father's signature. But Marcus still carried the weight of his mistakes, still struggled with shame. "I'm thankful for this family," Marcus had said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm thankful that I have a father who didn't give up on me when I gave up on myself. I'm thankful for a grandfather I never met who built this house with his own hands, who taught my father that family is worth fighting for. And I'm thankful for my mother." Marcus had paused, looking at Martha Johnson's empty chair, the one they always left at the table, "who raised me to be better than my worst day." Tears had run down Marcus's face, but Marcus didn't hide them. Marcus let his children see their father crying, let them see that real strength includes vulnerability and honesty. "And I'm thankful," Marcus had continued, "for second chances, for the chance to prove I can be the man this family needs me to be." Samuel Johnson had reached across the table and gripped his son's hand. "Marcus, you're already proving it. Every day you wake up and make the right choice, you're proving it. Your mother would be proud of you." After dinner, while the women cleaned up and the children played in the backyard, Samuel Johnson and his sons sat on the front porch. The November air was crisp but not yet cold. Leaves from the oak tree in the front yard, the tree Robert Johnson had planted in 1970, drifted down in lazy spirals, carpeting the lawn in red and gold. "Dad," David had said, "I've been thinking about what you said about prayer aligning our hearts with God's will. I realized I haven't been praying much lately. I got so caught up in work and trying to succeed in proving myself. I forgot about the foundation you and Mom built in me." Samuel Johnson had nodded. "Success is good, David. Your mother and I are proud of everything you've accomplished. But success without spiritual grounding is like building a house without a foundation. It looks good for a while, but when the storms come, and they always come, there's nothing to hold it together." "Teach me," David had said simply. "Teach me to pray the way you pray, the way you've prayed for this family for 40 years. And so, as the sun set on that Thanksgiving evening, Samuel Johnson had taught his sons about the prayer practice that had sustained him through 4 decades of life's challenges. Samuel Johnson explained how he started each day by acknowledging God's sovereignty, by thanking God for specific blessings, by confessing his own shortcomings, by interceding for each member of his family by name. "Prayer isn't complicated," Samuel Johnson had said. "You don't need fancy words or perfect theology. You just need to show up consistently and speak to God honestly. Tell him your fears, tell him your hopes. Ask for wisdom, ask for strength. And then, and this is important, listen. Sometimes God speaks in that quiet voice inside. Sometimes he speaks through circumstances, sometimes through other people. But he always speaks if we're willing to listen." Marcus had pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app. "Dad, can you walk me through exactly how you structure your morning prayers? I want to start doing this too." Samuel Johnson had looked at his son with pride. "Marcus, you asking that question tells me more about your recovery than 3 months of Gamblers Anonymous meetings. Yes, I'll teach you. I'll teach both of you. And maybe someday you'll teach your children, and this practice will continue in the Johnson family for generations to come." That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Samuel Johnson had knelt beside his bed one more time. The house was quiet, the dishes were washed, the leftovers were safely stored in the refrigerator. Samuel Johnson had placed his hands on the bed, closed his eyes, and begun to pray. "Father, thank you," Samuel Johnson had said into the darkness. "Thank you for saving this house. Thank you for Vincent Wade's courage. Thank you for my son Marcus's transformation. Thank you for this family and for the legacy my father left us." Samuel Johnson had paused, and in that pause he had felt something he couldn't quite name. Peace, certainly. Gratitude, absolutely. But something more than that, a sense of connection to something larger than himself, larger than his family, larger than even his father's memory. Samuel Johnson felt connected to every prayer ever prayed in this house, every blessing ever spoken over this threshold, every moment of faith that had sustained the Johnson family through nearly 60 years of living. Lord, Samuel Johnson had continued, I pray for everyone who is fighting to keep their homes, their families, their dignity intact. I pray for people like Vincent Wade who are trying to find their way back to doing right. I pray for people like Richard Harrison who have lost their way completely and don't even know it. I pray that the story of what happened in this house would be a testimony of your faithfulness, a reminder that you hear the prayers of your people. In the months that followed, the story of the Johnson house did indeed become a testimony. The local newspaper ran an article about the fraud scheme and its exposure. A reporter interviewed Samuel Johnson, who spoke not about his own cleverness or courage, but about the importance of faith, family, and community standing together against injustice. The article mentioned Samuel Johnson's morning prayer practice, and something unexpected happened. People started reaching out to Samuel Johnson, asking for advice, for prayer, for guidance. Young fathers who were struggling to provide for their families. Older people facing foreclosure or financial hardship. People who had lost their faith and were trying to find it again. Samuel Johnson welcomed them all. Samuel Johnson's living room became an informal counseling center, a place where people could come and be heard, where their burdens could be shared, where someone would pray with them and for them. Samuel Johnson never preached at people or condemned them for their mistakes. Samuel Johnson simply listened, offered wisdom when asked, and prayed. By the spring of 2026, 6 months after the confrontation with Richard Harrison, Marcus Johnson had been promoted at his warehouse job to shift supervisor. Marcus had not gambled in 9 months. Marcus's relationship with his children was slowly being restored. Marcus had started attending church again, sitting in the pew behind his father, listening to sermons with new ears. One Sunday in April, after the service, Marcus had approached his father with a question. Dad, I've been thinking about the title of our story, if someone were to tell what happened to our family. What would you call it? Samuel Johnson had considered the question carefully. I'd call it Morning Prayer to Cancel Evil Altars Over a Black Father's Household, Blessings Flow. Because that's exactly what happened. Every evil plan raised against this family was canceled. Every curse spoken over us was broken. And now, blessings are flowing not just to us, but through us to others. Marcus had nodded slowly. I used to think prayers were just words we said to make ourselves feel better, but I've seen something different now. I've seen prayers change reality. I've seen them change me. That's the power of consistency, Samuel Johnson had said. One prayer might feel small, but 40 years of prayers, day after day after day, build something powerful. They build a hedge of protection around a family. They build a foundation that can weather any storm. They build a legacy of faith that can be passed down to the next generation. As summer approached, Samuel Johnson celebrated his 63rd birthday. His children threw him a party in the backyard of the house on Maple Street, beneath the oak tree that was now 56 years old. Friends from church came. Neighbors came. Even Vincent Wade came, bringing his new girlfriend and announcing that he had been accepted into a teaching program at the local university. Mr. Johnson, Vincent Wade had said, pulling Samuel Johnson aside during the party, I wanted you to know that I'm starting a scholarship fund. It's for young men who have made mistakes and want to turn their lives around. I'm calling it the Robert Johnson Second Chance Scholarship after your father. I hope that's okay. Samuel Johnson had been moved beyond words. Samuel Johnson had embraced Vincent Wade, this young man who had once been an instrument of destruction against the Johnson family, but who had become an instrument of redemption. Vincent, my father, would have been honored. He believed in second chances. He believed that every person has worth regardless of their past. The party had lasted into the evening, with children running through the yard, adults sharing stories and laughter, food and fellowship binding everyone together. As the sun set, Samuel Johnson had stood on his front porch looking out at the neighborhood his father had been so proud to call home. Many of the original families had moved away. Some houses had been renovated, others had fallen into disrepair. But the community endured as it always had, resilient and alive. Lisa had come to stand beside her father. Dad, you're thinking about Grandpa Robert, aren't you? I am, Samuel Johnson had admitted. I'm thinking about how hard he worked to buy this house, how my mother saved every penny, how they sacrificed so much to give us a foundation, a place to call home, and I'm thinking about how close we came to losing it all. But we didn't lose it, Lisa had reminded him, because of your prayers, because of your faith, and because God is faithful, Samuel Johnson had added. He's always been faithful to this family, even in the darkest times, when your mother was sick. When I didn't know how we'd pay the bills, when Marcus fell into addiction, through it all, God has been faithful. They had stood together in comfortable silence, father and daughter, watching the last light fade from the sky. Inside the house, Samuel Johnson could hear his grandchildren laughing, could hear Marcus talking with his siblings, could hear the sounds of family that had filled these walls for nearly 60 years. "Dad," Lisa had said after a while, "do you still pray every morning?" "I mean, now that the crisis is over," Samuel Johnson had smiled. "Lisa, I'll pray every morning until the day I die. Prayer isn't just for crises. Prayer is for every day. Prayer is how I stay connected to God, how I keep my heart aligned with His will, how I continue to speak blessings over this household. The crisis may be over, but the work of prayer continues." A year after the confrontation with Richard Harrison, on a September morning in 2026, Samuel Johnson woke at 5 o'clock, as he had done every morning for 41 years. Samuel Johnson made his way to his bedroom and knelt beside the bed in that familiar worn spot on the carpet. But this morning, Samuel Johnson was not alone. Marcus knelt beside him, having moved back into his childhood bedroom and committed to learning his father's prayer practice. Together, father and son, they prayed. "Father God," Samuel Johnson began, his voice strong and clear in the pre-dawn darkness, "we come before you this morning as we come every morning, thanking you for your faithfulness. Thank you for this house that has sheltered our family for nearly 60 years. Thank you for the legacy of faith left to us by Robert Johnson. Thank you for the lessons learned through trials and the blessings that flow from obedience." Marcus had continued the prayer, his voice less practiced but equally sincere. "Lord, thank you for my father's example. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to change, never too late to do right. Thank you for this second chance. Help me to be the father, son, and man that you've called me to be." They had prayed together for 20 minutes, their voices overlapping and harmonizing, a new generation joining an old practice, ensuring that the spiritual foundation of the Johnson household would continue into the future. When they rose from their knees, Samuel Johnson had placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, Marcus. Not because you're perfect, but because you're trying. That's all any of us can do, wake up each day and try to do better than yesterday." "I learned that from you, Dad," Marcus had said. "You never gave up on me, even when I gave up on myself." "That's what family does," Samuel Johnson had replied simply. "We hold each other up. We speak blessings when the world speaks curses. We stand together against every evil altar raised against us. And we trust that God is faithful to complete the work He's begun in us." As the sun rose over Maple Street that morning, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, 2 generations of Johnson men sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee, talking about the day ahead, making plans for maintaining the house, discussing Marcus's upcoming 1-year sobriety milestone. The sounds of morning, the coffee pot percolating, the newspaper rustling, the easy conversation between father and son, were the same sounds that had filled this house for decades. This was the legacy Robert Johnson had built when he purchased this house in 1968 with his life savings. Not just walls and a roof, but a foundation of faith, a commitment to family, a determination to speak blessings instead of curses. This was what Martha Johnson had protected when she sewed those curtains and planted those roses and raised her children to value faith and family above all else. This was what Samuel Johnson had defended when he knelt each morning in prayer for 40 years, speaking protection over his household, canceling evil altars, declaring that blessings would flow. And the blessings did flow. They flowed through Vincent Wade finding redemption and starting a scholarship fund. They flowed through Marcus's recovery and transformation. They flowed through the dozens of people who came to Samuel Johnson seeking prayer and guidance. They flowed through the story itself, spreading through the community, encouraging others to stand firm in faith when facing their own crises. On a warm evening in October 2026, as Samuel Johnson sat on his front porch in his father's rocking chair, as he had done countless times over the years, Samuel Johnson reflected on everything that had happened since that morning prayer 14 months ago. The prayer that had seemed like any other prayer, just part of a daily practice stretching back 4 decades. But that prayer had set in motion a chain of events that saved a family's legacy, restored a broken son, redeemed a guilt-ridden young man, and touched countless lives. Samuel Johnson understood now, perhaps better than ever before, that prayers are never wasted. Every morning prayer builds on the one before it. Every blessing spoken strengthens the foundation. Every curse canceled clears the way for more blessings to flow. It was like Robert Johnson had told him years ago, when Samuel Johnson was just a young man learning to be a father. Son, you build a life one day at a time, one choice at a time, one prayer at a time. And if you're faithful in the small things, God will trust you with bigger things. Samuel Johnson had been faithful in the small things, faithful in waking at 5 each morning, faithful in kneeling beside the bed, faithful in speaking blessings over a household even when circumstances looked dark. And God had indeed trusted Samuel Johnson with bigger things, with being a light to his community, with showing mercy to those who had tried to harm him, with modeling redemption for his son, with demonstrating that faith is not passive hope but active trust. As darkness fell over Maple Street and the streetlights began to glow, Samuel Johnson closed his eyes and said a quiet prayer of thanksgiving. Tomorrow morning, Samuel Johnson would wake at 5 o'clock. Samuel Johnson would kneel beside the bed. Samuel Johnson would pray for protection, for wisdom, for blessing over the household. And Marcus would kneel beside him, learning the practice that would sustain him through his own life's challenges, ready to pass it down to his children someday. This was the story of morning prayer canceling evil altars over a black father's household. This was the testimony of how blessings flow when faith remains steady. This was the legacy of Robert Johnson and Martha Johnson and Samuel Johnson and all who came before them and all who would come after them. The house on Maple Street stood strong, its foundation built by calloused hands and sustained by faithful prayers, a testament to the power of family, faith, and daily commitment to seeking God's will. Inside its walls, generations had been raised and would continue to be raised, each one hearing the story of how their grandfather Samuel Johnson knelt each morning in prayer, speaking blessings instead of curses, canceling evil altars, ensuring that their household would stand firm against every attack. And every morning as the sun rose over that modest 3-bedroom house, the prayers continued, day after day after day, building, strengthening, protecting, blessing, because some traditions are worth maintaining. Some practices are worth passing down, and some legacies are worth fighting for. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.